Hello, everybody, and welcome to Jack's Corner. I'm Tarzan Bonanno, and with me, as always, is our founder, Jack Figgle. This week, we're jumping all the way back to the first meeting Jack had with JP2, Pope St. John Paul II. What's going on, Jack? How you doing?
Hi, Tarzan. Glory to Jesus Christ.
Glory to him forever.
I'm doing pretty good. We're just now starting Lent today for the Eastern Catholics,
And the
2 days
Latins.
before Ash Wednesday. We do a different calculation for Lent, but I won't go into that today. That's a whole lecture in and of itself.
We'll leave that to Callistos.
That's right. That's right. He's much better at it than I am. Yes, so we're kind of gonna go back in history to my first encounter with a pope, and that was in the year 1995, and it was the first time that Patriarch Bartholomew, the spiritual head of the Orthodox Church worldwide, Archbishop of Constantinople, today Istanbul, was the first time that he was going to go to Rome for the feast of Saints Peter and Paul, which was, of course, June 29th and 1995. It was also the June after Archbishop Judson Prosick of blessed memory had been appointed as Archbishop of Pittsburgh and Metropolitan of the U.S. Byzantine Catholic Ruthenian Church. And at that time, there was an issue about Eastern Catholic hierarchs receiving a pallium from the Pope of Rome, because the pallium represented, authority, and the Pope would placed the pallium on the metropolitan archbishops of the Roman Catholic Church that had been appointed in the previous 12 months on the Feast of Peter and Paul. And it was part of the big mass celebration that was held in St. Peter's on that date. And I had identified to my friends that had connections in Rome that this was going to be a bit of a problem to have Patriarch Bartholomew, the spiritual head of the Eastern churches, from where the Ruthenian Catholics received their Christianity through Cyril Methodius in the 9th century, for him to receive his pallium from the Pope instead of the Patriarch. He should have been getting it from the Patriarch, because that was where our Christianity came from, even though we were now back in commune with the Catholic Church. And so, for an archbishop to get a pallium in front of other Orthodox hierarchs that had come for the visit of Peter and Paul was not such a big deal, but here it was the Patriarch himself. So I identified this, was the, back then it was called the Congregation for the Oriental Churches, the Eastern Churches, who were scheduling Archbishop Judson to come in, coordinating with the Pontifical Council for Christian Unity, the ecumenical office that was inviting Patriarch Bartholomew. And I was assured, don't worry, it's not a problem, it'll be taken care of, and so forth. So I happened to be there for two reasons. One was, at the same time as the Patriarch was coming to Rome, a small group called the Kievan Church Study Group, which was a bunch of Ukrainian Catholic and Ukrainian Orthodox who were having a academic dialogue about the Church of Kiev and how to bring it back together again. And it was sort of overseen by then Bishop Callistos. So Callistos is now involved with this group, and he was sort of representing the ecumenical patriarch as not a Ukrainian, but involved in this group for ecumenical dialogue. And the other two leaders were my friend Archbishop Vsevolod of the Ukrainian Orthodox and Bishop Basil Lawston of the Ukrainian Catholics, who also I knew well and had published some books for him. So they were the three leaders, and they organized a meeting of their group at the same time as this visit of Bartholomew so that they could actually go and greet Bartholomew as a group while he was in Rome. And so that was one group, because they invited me to some of their sessions to take pictures and write reports for the Eastern Church's Journal. So they invited me to Rome to be with their group. At the same time, there was a group coming with Archbishop Judson from Pittsburgh, a bunch of clergy and lay folks from the Archdiocese, the Metropolitan See of Pittsburgh, as pilgrims to accompany him on getting his pallium. So there were about 80 in that group, and there were about 20 in the Kievan Study group. And I was sort of all through that week going back and forth between the two. I'd go to the Kievan Study group meeting when they needed me to take pictures, and I'd go and join the group from Pittsburgh because I knew them all. That's where I grew up. When they went on various sightseeing places as part of their trip to Rome. And so when it came time for the general audience, which is on Wednesdays, both the Kievan Study group bishops and all the other bishops, including Metropolitan Judson, were up with the Pope on the platform in front of St. Peter's. And I was with the 80-person group from Pittsburgh, seated in the Basilica with them, because that was, sort of a more appropriate place than the Kievan Study group for me to be seated. And it was, kind of exciting that, there was a general audience with Pope John Paul, the first time I'd seen him in person. So that was all kind of exciting. When that general audience was over, I remember Archbishop Judson coming over to us and saying, when this is over, I have a special surprise for you. So don't go anywhere, when we're done. So the general audience is over and everyone else is leaving the Basilica. And the Archbishop comes over and says, I have a special surprise for our group. The Vatican has arranged for us to have a private audience this evening with the Pope, John Paul, up in the Apostolic Palace. And that's where we'll have a symbolic exchange of the pallium for me.
And you did not know this was coming, right?
No, that's
and
right.
It was the first of many times that you would meet a pope.
That's right. So we were all told to gather at a particular door. It was called the Bronze Door, I believe, that has a long staircase up inside the Apostolic Palace to get to the audience rooms. And so as a group, we all showed up, and it was like supposed to be a super secret where we're not telling anybody to join us or anything. We were told that this was a special surprise just for us. So we all went and climbed the steps, and we were brought into a chapel area where we sat for a few minutes, and then the Pope's chair was in the front of the room, and Archbishop Judson took a seat over at the side of the room, already wearing his pallium, because he was consecrated as a bishop in the Byzantine service with equivalent of the pallium, namely the omophore that he wears, is symbolic the same way as the pallium is symbolic of the shepherd. Jesus Christ the shepherd. The pallium is worn by Roman Catholic archbishops, and the Byzantine form, he was already consecrated by the Byzantine bishops some 6 months before. So we had a prayer service that it seemed like it was constructed just for that purpose, just for us to have a couple of prayers and some singing. And at the end, the Archbishop came and just exchanged a kiss of peace with the Pope. And that was the symbolic gesture of receiving the pallium, just as a sign of communion with the Pope, and not necessarily a jurisdictional kind of thing, although in fact we are under the jurisdiction of the Vatican. the next morning was the big mass for St. Peter and Paul, the feast day. And because it was stormy summer weather outside, predictions of rain, we were all invited and we had seats inside the basilica for the mass. It was not outdoors. The weather was not cooperating. So we were all in St. Peter's. The place was packed. And the rumor that I was hearing from my Kievan church study friends was that announcement was going to be made between the Pope and the Patriarch at that Mass that the Catholic Church was going to drop the phrase filioque, which in Latin means "and the Son," from the creed to go back to the original form of it that was agreed at the first and second ecumenical councils. That's why it's called the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed. The first part was written in Nicaea, the second part in Constantinople. Return to the original form that did not have the filioque, because that was added by the Western Church at the time of Charlemagne without approval of the East. And that issue, the filioque, is what led to the split or schism of 1054, because that was the thing that Rome was trying to get Constantinople to agree to, and that was put the word filioque into their version of the creed. And the answer was, well, we need an ecumenical council to do that, and you can't just do it unilaterally. And that's what led to the excommunications and the big split. So it was a major issue all through the history of the church, this notion of the filioque. And the Council of Florence, as Callistos has taught in one of his lectures, lasted for quite some time, and they spent almost all the time on the filioque and very little time on the primacy of the Bishop of Rome. So it was a big controversy all through the history of trying to reconcile East and West. And so we get to this big papal mass, and all of the archbishops who are going to get the pallium are all seated up front, very close to the altar. But I noticed that Archbishop Judson was not there. And so we were told that he received the pallium at the ceremony the night before, and so he was not going to receive it there from the Pope, because the issue was it would not be appropriate for the Pope to give Archbishop Judson a pallium in the presence of Patriarch Bartholomew. And so Archbishop Judson was seated in the congregation with the other ranking hierarchs. But the programs had already been printed, the liturgy books, and it listed the names of all the archbishops getting the pallium, including his. So, that was my confirmation. It was a last minute arrangement that was done because the books had him listed. When the master of ceremonies got to his name, he stumbled a little bit and had to skip over it because he was not going to get it there at that time. He got it the night before. So at that night before session, the group was brought into the Clementine Hall after the prayer service, and we had gathered in a circle all around the edge of the room. And the Pope then was escorted by the Archbishop around, meeting each one of us in line. And we were told that because he had just had hip surgery at that time, he was still having a little difficulty walking, but it was easier for them to control the line if they moved the Pope from person to person, rather than having us come up to greet the Pope and spend time chatting with them. This way they could, keep the line moving. So it was sort of a way to control how much time you got with them if they could move him along.
Or, keep the line moving, meaning move the line.
Yeah.
The line's not moving. They're moving through the line.
Yeah, easier to move the Pope through the line than the line through the Pope.
What is just basically a procession or
Yeah, right,
well, a
right.
process
So
the
we were
Pope
all lined
generally.
up, and the Pope came down and greeted each person. The Archbishop knew everyone by name, so he was introducing each of us to the Pope. We got to shake his hand and kiss it, got a blessing from him, and so that was my first, 15-second greet the Pope moment. And I have a picture of it. And it turns out in the background next to me was at the time seminarian Andrew Diskevich, who is now Father Andrew and is the proto-syncellus of the Archeparchy of Pittsburgh. So in 1995, which is now almost 30 years ago, Father Andrew was a seminarian standing next to me when we both met the Pope for the first time.
And how close are you to him now? Like, how well do you
Oh,
know
pretty
him?
close. He and I are, in email contact, and he's always very busy, looking after. He's also rector of the cathedral in Pittsburgh, so he's got a couple of big hats to wear. So I don't bother him too much. But
Did
he's very friendly, and we've sort of kept in touch over those years. Um,
did you know him at
and
all at that time?
Trevor's, and I think not the last time I saw him, but a couple of years ago, I made a blow up copy of the picture I had because he did not have that particular one in his collection, and I gave it to him as a gift.
Did you know him at all during that time?
No,
It
no,
turns out
we were
that
standing next to each other just randomly, and you know, we met for the first time at that event, and we just kept in touch since. Um, back to the private session that we had uh, when it was over. What I remember that was most moving about it was um, we sang a "God Grant You Many Years" for the Pope as he was leaving, and I remember it was we sang with such gusto. The 80 of us, we filled the chapel with a resounding singing, and we did it in Church Slavonic that everybody could just sing to the heart's content. And I remember because the Pope was, of course, a Slav, he knew the words, so he knew what we were doing, uh, and he had a big smile on his face as he went walking out of the chapel.
yeah. I make so my wife is half Polish, so I constantly make the joke that like he's forever her her pope because they're both Slavs. Like, yep.
Well, it turned out that in my subsequent encounters with him, it was you know easy to talk to him because he knew both English as well as Slavonic, and the greetings I gave him of Slavisus Christu and Nohayalita, he responded in English and knowing exactly what I was saying. So didn't need much of a translation for that part. So at the big papal mass, the Pope and Patriarch were up at the main altar, seated on a platform in chairs next to each other, all through the liturgy of the Word, the first part of the Mass. And when it came time for the liturgy of the Eucharist to start, the Patriarch was escorted over to a side platform underneath actually the statue of St. Andrew, the patron saint of Constantinople. Uh, and he and his entourage were seated there as a small group. And then the mass continued with both the Paladin ceremony as well as then the rest of it. I remember then Bishop Callistos, that I knew from the Kievan Study Group as well as other efforts with Oriental Lumen a few years later, 97 when we started. He told me the story that when it came time for the Eucharist, there was a sudden thunderstorm that came up outside St. Peter's, loud enough that we could hear the thunder rumbling over the choir singing. And there was flashes of lightning coming through the outside windows. And Callisto said the patriarch leaned over and said to Callistos, I wonder what the monks on Mount Athos would think of this. That the sudden flash of lightning appeared. Are they approving or disapproving? So we are all expecting some sort of announcement dealing with the filioque. And in the end, there was no announcement made. Nothing ever came of that. They continued the dialogue, which continues to this day. They made slow progress on all sorts of issues. The filioque has not officially ever been removed in the Roman Church, but Byzantine Catholics typically have it now removed from their liturgical books.
Yeah.
In the 60s, it was there, but now in the 90s and since, it's been taken out.
Yeah, a couple months ago, over in the summertime, I there's a big music festival that's put on by the Catholic diocese in Cleveland, and so my wife and I and a couple of our friends went over. She's my fiance at the time. But before we went to the festival, we brought my friend to his first ever Byzantine liturgy, and he and his wife just stared at me when they didn't say the filioque. I was like, they don't do that here.
Mm-hmm.
So it's funny.
Yep. No, that's right. So I've often wondered over the last 30 years or so if they had come to some agreement to remove the filioque from the Roman Mass, what the dialogue might have been like today if they had made that small step back then. And in fact, at the Mass in St. Peter's, with the patriarch there, they recited the creed because it's before the Eucharist starts, together, side by side, in Greek, without the filioque.
Yeah.
And so at that papal Mass, it was not in the creed that was recited by the two of them together. And my understanding is, in Greece and other places where the Greek language is used, even for the Roman Mass, they do not use the filioque. And certainly in the Byzantine Catholic churches now, it's becoming, it's been removed in most.
As far as I can tell, being somebody on the west of things, it seems that it's not necessary in in ecumenical or any type of thing such as this. It still happens in my Latin Mass, which isn't really, it's not the traditional Latin Mass, but it's, Latin Rite. But if there is a Greek priest, Byzantine, it's never said, even if it is a Latin Rite form.
The Melkites have kept it out, I think, all through their history, whereas the Ruthenians, even in, I believe, the Church Slavonic books, they put it in brackets.
Yeah, you don't need to do this. Yeah,
as either optional or to set it apart. And finally, in 2007, in the U.S., in the English editions, when the books were made, they kept out the filioque without the brackets. And I believe in the newer Church Slavonic editions that have come out in Europe, the newer books are going back. And it's my view that the reason it was added in, of course, was to make these Byzantine Catholics look more Catholic, because there was all sorts of conflicts about whether or not we were really Catholic way back in the 20th century.
I mean, it's likely when they joined back in, but I thought you were talking about why they added the filioque in the beginning, and that would follow suit with why it's not there, because neither the East or the West fall into the heresy they were trying to prevent by adding the filioque in the first place,
Right.
so it's not necessary within
Yeah,
our
and
groups.
that's my personal view. I'd be willing to bet you that 99.9% of Roman Catholics don't know what the issue is, and if it was removed, they wouldn't really care much.
Yeah, I mean,
They may or may not even notice.
the only time it's ever brought up that I've seen is it's like if it's not said, and like when my friends went to their first Byzantine liturgy and it wasn't said.
Yeah.
It's the fact that it was in a different form.
So that was my first ever seeing a pope in person at the general audience, and then that night having this special surprise opportunity to actually greet him and shake his hand and kiss his hand, and it was it was kind of a special event that I'll never forget. And there was a little bit of controversy, which of course I've never forgotten either.
Nobody ever will.
Yeah.
All right, so that concludes this one.
Yep.
All right.
That's it for these stories. Yep.
Well, since that concludes this episode of Jack's Corner and this whole series of the Papal Audiences, next week when we come in, we will have a new series for you. Don't forget that this Wednesday and Thursday begins Lent. So, prepare to fast. Anyways, from us here, thank you for coming, and God bless. Bye-bye.